Well, Martin Garwood is a senior aquarist at the Sydney Aquarium and he joins me now. Martin, good morning. How unusual is this in terms of the number of attacks over a period of, say, 12 months?
Listen, it's very unusual. Our national average has usually been one fatality a year from sharks. So obviously having 4 confirmed and 1 non-confirmed fatality from sharks within a 10-month period, it's really out of the ordinary, and there's really no obvious reason for why at the moment.
Okay, we'll take a closer look at that in a moment, but where generally are the most shark attacks in Australia along the Australian coastline from great whites?
So Western Australia and Southern Australia are the hot spots for great whites, so they migrate between those regions and South Africa and California.
But there have been attacks on other parts of the Australian coastline?
Yes, but they're just a lot rarer. So the main attacks from great whites are going to be in Western Australia and Southern Australia.
Yep. Are there more great white sharks around now than there have been previously? Is there any studies showing that?
The problem is there's no reliable data to go on. So there are a few studies that have tried to track great white shark population numbers, but they haven't returned very accurate results. And the problem with that is that in perhaps one California study was for 3 years and they only caught 23 individual specimens. So it shows that there's not many out there to catch, so that's why they're not getting reliable data, but it does show that populations are for the most part, quite low throughout the world's oceans.
Just take us through that a little more. Well, how does that prove the populations are low?
So it doesn't prove it, but it just suggests it. So, for example, a 3-year study, what they do is go out and they try and catch sharks, tag them, and then use that tagging data to show where the sharks are going, and then when they can try and recatch, see how many of those tags are still around. So what it shows is that if they're catching low numbers when they're deliberately targeting these great whites, it means that there's generally a very low density of sharks around in the oceans.
Could it also suggest that they're just a bit hard to find?
It could, and it also shows that being migratory, they could be out of the area, so they could be congregating in sites other than where those studies are trying to collect sharks. But the general consensus throughout shark science is that these shark numbers are quite low throughout the world's oceans.
When you get a number of attacks like this, 5 over a period of 10 months, would scientists start to think that maybe there are more sharks, that this would indicate there are more sharks around than there were previously?
Generally, this isn't indicative of more sharks. It's usually indicative of the way people are using the ocean. So adventure sports and surfing in remote locations has gotten a lot more popular over the last decade. So it's showing that people are using the ocean in a broader sense than we ever used to, and in much more remote locations. So it's really more indicative of the way humans are using the ocean as opposed to the amount of sharks in this instance.
But you can't really say that definitively, can you? Because there just aren't, you haven't got the research to prove that the numbers aren't increasing or are falling.
That's exactly right. And one of the best suggestions that's come out of this is the Fisheries Minister potentially reassessing whether great white sharks belong on the protected species list. So that reassessment would involve an accurate population study specifically for Australia and the West Australian coast. So getting that up-to-date information would provide us all with whether or not there's more sharks and whether action needs to be taken.
But is it possible to do an accurate study of the great white generally?
With the required resources, it's possible to do a fairly accurate study. Obviously, it's hard to predict from this seat whether or not you're going to get good data out of that kind of study, but with the right resources and the right people involved, there's no reason to say you couldn't get an accurate assessment of how many great whites are off the coast of Western Australia and in what seasons there might potentially be more or less.
What sort of resources have been thrown towards this previously?
In general, Western Australia has looked to research through universities, so there has been a few tagging studies done off the Australian coast and in New South Wales as well to see, mostly in those studies it was migration and where the sharks are going more so than the population numbers.
Yeah. So what's your idea of how a rigorous study could be done in terms of what kind of funding would it need, how many people would need to be involved?
It's hard just to off the top of my head give you a number like that, but it definitely needs to involve the shark researchers at universities in Western Australia and the government. If they want to find out a proper number and try and find out a proper assessment of this species off the coast, they need to invest a significant amount to get the job done. So they need to talk to the shark scientists in Western Australia and try and have a communication in terms of how they can get that done effectively.
Well, in the meantime, there are obviously people who still love swimming, surfing and diving. What's your best advice to them in terms of trying to minimise the risks?
The best thing you can do is swim at a surf patrol beach or surf at a surf patrol beach. You have lifesavers there who are looking out for you in a higher danger of rips and tides and drowning, which is a much greater risk to swimmers and surfers in Australia. But they're also there to look out for any potential signs of sharks, and they have the sirens to keep you safe. So if you're at a surf patrol beach and the statistics show that's the safest place that you can swim.